Welcome to Plug In for More, brought to you by EVUniverse.com. EV Universe is your one-stop shop for all things related to the electric vehicle. Here on this podcast, our goal is to educate, inspire, and hopefully make your transition into the electric vehicle marketplace a lot less intimidating. And now, here are your hosts, Mike, Tom, and Bryant.
So on today's podcast, we're going to be talking about an article that was floating around the internet that maybe you saw. It was from the Wall Street Journal, so it was a wide publication, and it was written by Rachel Wolf, titled, "I rented an electric car for a 4-day road trip, and I spent more time charging than I did sleeping." And she happened to rent the car that is near and dear to my heart, which is the EV6. And her trip was very eventful, and we're going to dive into it today. Talk a little bit about her trip. We have a guest on the podcast, Aaron, who also owns an EV6, who's just done a way longer road trip than she did to get his experience. Mike is planning a trip from North Carolina up to Michigan in a few days. We're going to hear Mike's experience with a Tesla. I have yet to take a very long road trip. As you guys know, I've taken 2 small ones, which I've talked about before. So I have a little bit of experience, but we want to maybe dive in and not be critical of her article, but we just want to dissect it and find out maybe some areas she could have improved on and had a better experience, because she clearly, if she spent more time charging than she did sleeping, that's a problem. But just to recap, if you've not seen the article or read the article, she was driving from New Orleans to Chicago, and she planned roughly 7.5 hours of driving with charging and then a hotel overnight. In theory, that should be fine. She used one of the apps I like to use, the PlugShare app, which shows user-generated chargers. And there's literally thousands of charging options between New Orleans and Chicago. But her first mistake, I think, is she was trying to stop at level 2 and level 1s, which we've talked about in the podcast, but we'll talk a little bit more. But the EV6 is one of the fastest charging, if not the fastest charging EV that I'm aware of in the market, promising 80%, from 20 to 80% or 20 to 100% in 15 to 20 minutes. And I've experienced that myself at a fast charger. So in theory, she should have been set up for success. But she ran into some difficulties, and I think we'll dive into those. But just off the top of my head here, one of the difficulties she ran into was I kept noticing she used dealership chargers, which we'll ask, Mike and Aaron in a second if they've ever used one. I've never used a dealership charger before. I'm not quite sure the etiquette, but she pulled into a Nissan dealership, a Mazda dealership, and she was surprised it was taking her 3-4 hours to add 20 or 30 miles. That's level 1. That's level 1, maybe like slow level 2 charging. So we'll talk about that in today's podcast and dive in. I'm excited to broach this subject because it's near and dear to my heart. So with that, Mike or Aaron or Tom, any thoughts around, the article and your point of view of, maybe some things she could have done better to have a better experience?
Well, I would really like to hear from Aaron. Aaron, you've got the exact same vehicle she took, and with what your trip, you just been on a very long trip, and I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but can you dive into, what trip you just completed, how long that took, some of the issues you ran into, and I believe this was your first long trip in an EV. I just want to compare and contrast, if you when you read that article versus what you experienced, and I think your trip was actually longer. Can you give us all those details and really what your thoughts were after reading it?
Sure. So, just to summarize my trip was from Central Ohio all the way to the furthest I went was Needles, California. Right, so Southern California. There, have family in Northern Arizona. I was going out to visit. So round trip. I did about 4,500 miles. So on my way out, basically went the southern route, which is the shortest route from basically Columbus, Ohio to Kingman, Arizona. But on the way back, I actually kind of got derailed on my mission as well due to the wildfires and had to head north and ended up all the way north, going through Colorado, through Nebraska, and visiting some family in Iowa before returning home. So it was a little bit longer on the way back. And I didn't plan that effectively and noticed that there was a road closure on 40. I just started driving and found out when I got to Albuquerque. But on that trip, yeah, I seriously had no major issues whatsoever. I was uh, I was kind of intrigued by the article. I actually read her article before I actually departed because it came out right before I think I left for the first trip, and was actually a little frustrated. It felt a little as if, I don't know, if like my grandmother suddenly jumped into an EV and tried to take a road trip without having any knowledge of the vehicle or how charging works. Um, I drove my trip out using mainly Electrify America chargers on the way out, and I was really impressed with the network that they had strung out along that major route, that major interstate, to where I could even skip chargers en route and not have to worry about running out of range in my EV6. In comparison, as you guys already alluded to, it seemed as if she was using a lot of dealership chargers, a lot of level two chargers, maybe the occasional level one in there, which, if you know anything about the vehicle you're driving, you should have a little bit of an expectation as to what range you're going to get using those, or what range you're going to return from those chargers. And I did actually, in my trip back, because I wasn't on a timeline, a strict time schedule, when I got derailed, I also searched for a different experience. Instead of just using all Electrify America, I did use some dealer chargers. I did seek out some free higher speed chargers. I was traveling out to Arizona, Southern California, with my teenage son and our dog, and I was traveling back with just the dog, and no real timeline that I had to return. So I wanted to kind of get that experience a little bit more. And I did have some successes with some dealership chargers, and with others, there were some struggles. One thing that I did notice about dealership chargers is that a lot of them would lock up their facilities, close the gates, control access to those chargers after hours. And to be honest, sometimes when I was coming in looking to use a lower speed free charger, it was after hours, and I would find that it was, closed off. But I did plan for a little bit of that. And it was mentioned earlier, the PlugShare app. Some of the cool tips within that PlugShare app is that the user community is providing some of that feedback. So I kind of knew that some of those might be hit or miss with access just by using that app in advance. So I didn't overextend myself to try and get there and be left with no range to go elsewhere if I needed to. What I found was the biggest difference in taking the EV journey across country compared to in a regular ICE vehicle that I've done several times was just that I had to plan a little bit more, right? When we're driving in a gas vehicle, in an ICE vehicle, you know that pretty much every exit on that interstate is going to have fuel available. It might be $1 more than you want to pay, but pretty much everywhere is going to have that fuel available. Whereas in driving cross country in the EV, I just had to plan and navigate basically from charger to charger instead of just from destination to destination, which takes a little bit more planning, which not everybody, I think, is accustomed to yet. And I think that might have been a little bit of her flaw in her strategy in being prepared for that journey as well. Once you get past that mindset and you just look at those as mini destinations along your route, between the navigation systems in the vehicles, and most EVs these days have pretty high tech navigation systems that allow you to find near chargers, right? And using apps like PlugShare or the charging apps like Electrify America's app, you can plan out really easily along their app. Or I also did a comparison with a Better Route Planner because I'd never used that app previously. Using those combinations of apps and things like that, it doesn't take a ton of time to effectively plan out a trip that is not going to leave you charging more than sleeping. For example, the trip out there, we spent, and I logged everything as I went, how much time I spent at each charger, right? What I was getting at different chargers. I did a much better time of that on the way out. There were a couple on the way back that I might have forgot to write down. But on the way out, I spent 5 hours and 42 minutes of time charging from outside of Columbus, Ohio to Needles, California. a total of 5 hours and 42 minutes. And mind you, some of that was by choice. In Oklahoma City, there was a free charge point access that was a 62.5 kilowatt at a bank. And I went, well, this is a great time to take a nice nap. So my son and I were both tired, so neither of us were gonna continue that driving. So we plugged in there for a slower charge to allow us to rest a couple hours before proceeding on our journey, right? To make sure that we were driving safely. So I planned things like that out as well. Like, when was I gonna hit a slower charger? And it wasn't on purpose. There were faster ways to do the trip, but sometimes I wanted that slower charge because I could just relax. I could take the dog to a nearby dog park and get some exercise. We could walk around, we could eat dinner. But that does involve a little more planning than I think most people are accustomed to at this stage of the game that may be used to driving a traditional ICE vehicle.
Yeah. Hey, Aaron, I want to jump in there for a second because I think you touched on a point that some of our listeners may completely understand, but some of them may not. So we covered it in a previous podcast: level 1, level 2, and level 3 charging. So with level 1, just as a reminder, that's 110 outlet. That's like a 3-prong that you would normally plug your toaster in at your house. That's where you get just a few miles per hour of charge, which is what that woman did a fair amount of on her journey with the Wall Street Journal. Then level 2, that's where you're getting a little bit more. That's the 220, and that the 220 outlet, or like that's comparable to a clothes dryer, and you're going to get anywhere from 30 to 50 miles of range per hour. And then the level 3 is the DC fast charging, which is analogous to the Tesla superchargers and Electrify America that you mentioned. So just as a reference point for people, that's kind of what you're talking about. Um, other than that, I mean, did you see seeing that this was your first long road trip in an EV, and the EV6 obviously is a very new vehicle. You haven't had it for that terribly long. Um, what were I guess, did you have a fair amount of range anxiety when you first started, and how did that ease up versus when you pulled into your driveway after this long road trip? Where were those levels when you left versus where you came back?
So I'm glad you asked, because I briefly mentioned a better route planner, and a better route planner does kind of lay out percentage wise what it expects your vehicle to have when you arrive at the next charging spot. And that is where I would say my largest amount of range anxiety came in taking this trip was, do I trust that app? So I started out really kind of tracking alongside, well, what did the app say I should have when I got here versus how accurate it was. And then there were times in the journey, because as we head out west, we've got major elevation changes. When you start to climb the mountains, you've got range differences that start to happen. I found myself deviating from a better route planner to stop a little bit earlier, right? So instead of skipping that next EA charger, I said, well, maybe I'll just pop in and spend 5 minutes and get a little bit more range just in case. So that's kind of where my personal range anxiety came in on that journey. On the way back, I think I'd gotten past that. Although, in all fairness, I didn't use a better route planner at all on the way back because I was in less of a hurry. Once I got derailed in Albuquerque, it was, let's just have fun with this and see where we go. And I made a couple phone calls to family in Iowa and said, hey, I'm going to swing through. What are you guys doing tomorrow night? Which happened to be Father's Day. I'm going to swing through on Father's Day if you guys are going to be home. And they were like, yeah, we're going to be here. So come on by. So I kind of made a little bit more of a journey out of it because I wasn't in a rush to get back. In fact, I mentioned that it took me about 5 hours and 42 minutes worth of charging on my way out there. The longer trip back, where I was a little bit more relaxed and hit a lot more free chargers on the way back, I think I spent, well, let me check. I got a spreadsheet here. I spent about 13 and a half hours of charging time. And that includes some charging that I did on just a 6 kilowatt where I took a long nap. So several hours that I just let it go on a 6 kilowatt charger during that time.
So just to go back to referencing that Wall Street Journal article, Brian, I guess I don't know off the top of my head what that mileage was that she took to get from, if it was 800 miles or whatever it was versus what Aaron did. But, I just want to compare that just number wise. I don't think we're even on your slow, planned out journey that you had to complete derail. Um, it still was a heck of a lot shorter time frame than what she noticed.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, New Orleans, Chicago, it's I don't know, 1,000 miles, 800 miles, something like that. It's not 4,500 that you drove, Aaron. That's for sure.
That
Hey,
is certain.
Aaron, I was curious. Did you spend any time in a hotel? Um, and did you find any problems with hotels not having any chargers, or was that an issue? 'Cause that's a question I often get from people. It's like, well, what if I stop at a hotel with no charger? What was your experience for that?
So that's an interesting question. I had originally thought about doing so. I have a tendency, my wife, it drives her nuts to take these road trips and just drive. I enjoy driving. I enjoy being in a vehicle. I enjoy being on the road. So I oftentimes don't plan out hotel stops in advance, and just as I'm on the road, if I feel the need, then I'll stop. So on the way out, we had actually anticipated stopping a few times for hotels, but between myself and my 17-year-old son and the way in which we traveled this journey, we never really stopped. Like, we were well rested, each of us, at each stop. In fact, and this is going to sound absurd, and when I really sat down and did it, I arrived in Arizona 2 days faster than I thought I was going to when I originally made the plans, because
Wow.
I anticipated some hotel stays, and I anticipated running into to charging issues and things of that nature. I put all that buffer in there because I just didn't know. And I actually ended up getting there quicker than I'd ever done that journey, even in an ICE vehicle. And when I really looked at that and I went, how is that possible? It boiled down to a few things. The journey itself is very different, right? I was traveling with my teenage son. He did a little bit of the driving. We had the dog with us. The more frequent stops that I took in the EV actually had me much more alert and awake on that journey, because I was getting out of the vehicle more frequently. I was stopping, I was exercising the dog, right? I had the time to do those things. So every time I got back behind that wheel, I was wide awake and ready to go, or my son was wide awake and ready to go. So we just didn't feel like we wanted to stop. Versus driving 5 hours nonstop in an ICE vehicle, you start to fatigue, I think, a lot more frequently. So I was shocked that in the end, my journey was actually a lot quicker going out there than I had previously in an ICE vehicle.
I just want to like drive that point home that again, your trip was faster in the EV cross country basically than it was previously in an ICE vehicle.
Yeah, by about my previous time, by about 3.5 hours.
And
Hmm.
that wasn't just, I mean, again, being kind of EV focused here, I don't want to, I guess, over tilt towards the EV side of things, but that wasn't something, it wasn't like a record set. You're trying to do this as best you possibly could. This is just how it happened because of the alertness that you're talking about.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
That's fantastic. That's awesome.
I think you're stumbling onto something, Aaron. That's probably pretty critical. Is I don't think Rachel, she doesn't own an EV. She rented one, so she probably wasn't familiar with the concept you're talking about, which I agree with. In my limited road trips, I've just done a couple, two small 300-mile ones where you have to plan around chargers, and I completely 100% agree with you on the range anxiety from the ChargePoint app, because you're not quite sure, right? And so I agree. I've always stopped, just I'll take that extra charge because it's supposed to get home at 5%. And you're like, I'm not sure if I feel comfortable with being home at 5%, right? I'd rather come home at 25% or 30%. But I think you're right. If you're not used to planning out around chargers and you're just gonna like get off at any random stop that has a charger, and it's a Nissan dealership that's a slow level one or maybe a slow level two, I can see why she had a problem versus, because there's multiple. If you look at the route she took from New Orleans to Chicago, Tom found it's 927 miles to be exact. There's multiple level 3 Electrify America chargers on that route that you just referenced that I've used personally that will charge the car. I've had it right from 20% to 100% in 18 minutes. So I'm not sure why she didn't use those, but to your point, if she had planned around that, she would have had no article to write because it would have been
Yeah.
really, really simple. So,
Yeah, well, and that's I'm looking at a better route planner right now, going from New Orleans to Chicago. and with that same vehicle, it's showing 2 hours and 30 minutes of charging, so 5 different stops. Um, and I think that's being a little bit even conservative there, looking at the charge percents on here. So I feel like it was kind of just a almost seat of the pants. Let's go on this trip and see what happens. I'm not purposely not going to do any research on how this charging thing works, and maybe I'll just write it because it, you know, isn't going to turn out if someone doesn't do any research at all, which, is a lot of the things we talk about on this podcast and with the company is it takes a little bit of education when you're moving from an ICE vehicle to an EV. It doesn't take that much, frankly, as I think a lot of people have made that transition. It's kind of your first long trip, and then you're like, okay, I get it. No big deal. Let's just go on my next one. You don't think about it anymore. But people see it on their first trip. They're a little bit nervous. They're not sure where to go. They figure out which apps they need to use. Once you have that part down as far as what apps and what the navigation is going to be like, you don't really think about it. For me, in my upcoming trips, as Bryant mentioned earlier, I'm going from Michigan from North Carolina up to Michigan, which is just under 1,000 miles that trip each way. Those I'm not going to plan that out. I'm just going to get in my car and go. Now, that is a Tesla. So it's a Model Y long range, a little bit different vehicle. And I think when you look at the apps and the charging stops, it's maybe slightly simpler in a Tesla versus some of the other manufacturers out there. And one other thing I do have that might slightly different than some other Tesla owners is with the new Model Ys and most of the new Teslas, you can charge on the CCS network as well. So it does have that capability, and I do have an adapter that I bought that allows me to charge at Electrify America and some of the other charging stops as well. So not only will I be able to use the Tesla superchargers, but also the EA Electrify America chargers too. So if that's going to work a little bit better, I'll even be a little bit quicker than what I was previously. So anyways, to me, again, it just seems like a little bit of research, a little bit of time spent learning about what you need to do with an EV goes a long way. And once you make that transition, it's kind of done. But
yeah. In all fairness, though, Mike,
Yeah, go ahead,
you
Aaron.
have a long history with electric vehicles, so it's not going to be your first rodeo. So that planning isn't something you're stressing over because you've kind of been there and done that. For those of us who might be taking our first long trip, I think having that planning is kind of a necessity to
Yes.
get past some of that range anxiety issue that you may have.
Yeah, 1,000% agree. I mean, especially on your first one, I feel like once you do that research and you experience your first road trip, it kind of eases that anxiety and you know what to do. And you get to a place very quickly to kind of where I'm at after a number of years where, okay, I've done this. These are the apps I need to use. And this is how I need to make my trip. It's not so burdensome like it might be for the first time.
Aaron, I think you and I were talking. You're taking another long trip. Do you want to preview that one and maybe anything you learned on your first trip? It sounded like pretty painless, but any differences in mindset on this next trip and where you're going?
Sure. So yeah, we'll be heading back out. I left my son in northern Arizona, so now it's time to go get him. um, so this trip will be going out. My wife and my youngest son will be joining us on this journey, and she thinks the dog's coming. I'm not sold on that yet, but we'll be taking the trip back out. We're actually going to go back the way I came home. So we're going to go through Iowa. We're going to go the northern route. We're going to look actually at some properties in some rural areas of Colorado. So I'm looking at how am I going to effectively plan out that charging. We're going to spend a couple nights in some places in Colorado and then proceed down back towards northern Arizona. And then they're going to fly back, and I'm going to drive back with my other son who was left in Arizona because he wanted to jump back in the EV and didn't want to fly. So he enjoyed it that much and enjoyed the journey. And then, yeah, we're going to make a return trip. And that return trip, I don't have planned out. I don't know what route we're going to take. I think we're going to fly by the seat of our pants on that and see where we end up and where the road kind of takes us on that trip.
Interesting. That'll be cool. I'm excited to hear how it goes. And two questions for you specifically on this. So the EV6 does not come with a charger. I had to purchase a level one, and I just got a level two installed in my house finally. But are you bringing a level one with you just in case, or what is your plan? Are you just saying, you know what, I'm just doing charging networks, I'm not bringing anything with me? Like, are you bringing one with? I'm just curious on that.
So you're right. I was a little surprised when I purchased my EV6 to find that there was not a level one that came with it. I had been planning in advance of getting an electric vehicle, and I was one of those early reservation holders for the Cybertruck, which I'll never see apparently.
Don't say that. That hurts my soul.
Yeah,
Yeah.
mine too. Mine too. So we did a kitchen remodel last year, and what I did was I actually had my electrician, since we were redoing everything, I had my electrician at that time install a Tesla Level 2 in my garage. So I used an adapter to charge my EV6 in it, and it works really fine. So I was okay when I got it home, but I knew I'd be taking this trip, and I wanted that added security. But I also wanted to find something that, because I do have family that live across the country, that in the event I did have to stay long term, it wasn't just a level one. So I actually bought one of those level one slash level two chargers. It has an adapter to go to level one that I can plug in when I am out there if I had to stay longer. But the reality is, it might get 4.5 kilowatts at a level two speed in a dryer outlet, but still, that's better than getting 1.4 on a level one. If I had to stay out there for any extended period of time, but I do bring one just for that reason and just in case. And to be honest, that while I'm staying with family, I can just throw it in overnight and maybe get 15% on a level one overnight if I needed it.
Yeah,
Hey,
that
Aaron,
that makes sense.
just to make. Oh, go ahead, Bry.
No, I was just gonna say that makes sense, Aaron. I think, one tip, I was talking to a cars and coffee guy, and he had a Rivian, and a tip he was doing, which I hadn't even thought of, is he was taking a road trip down south, whereas he lives in Florida from Michigan, and he was gonna stop at campgrounds along the way and bring his charger with and get just an electrical outlet and camp and charge his car overnight. And I never even thought of that, but that's, campgrounds, marinas, like they all have shore station power for a boat. They all have, plugins for RVs. It's just something that wasn't on my radar until this Rivian owner mentioned it to me.
Yeah, that's actually an old Tesla Roadster trick. That's what they used back in the day. I'm big in that community. I wouldn't say I'm big in the community, but I try to be as active as I possibly can. And there's some really early adopters in that group, and a lot of them have done cross country and actually across the world trips. In obviously you're not crossing oceans, but um, using campgrounds, and those were the only sort of places they could charge back in the day, rather than trying to find someone's house with a dryer outlet near the outside of their house or something. Crazy. So that's what a lot of them did. So it's funny, kind of, it's going back to that in some regard, is those are kind of the backup options.
Yeah, and I can testify to having done that as well. So I know I've mentioned maybe not recently here, but I do a lot of traveling on the weekends for dog-related competitions. And when my wife comes with me, sometimes instead of like getting a hotel, we like to kind of just camp. We always really have. So we will rent a campground with electric utility on it for basically RVs or whatever, and we'll camp out overnight. So we'll have a dog competition that lasts 2 days. We'll go on Saturday. We'll camp out, enjoy ourselves, and recharge Saturday night, and head back to this day two of the competition on Sunday. So we have done that a handful of times already. The thing that you want to keep in mind is not all outlets are the same, right? So I did have to purchase several different adapters to get the charger to work. Whether it was my sister's dryer outlet, my mother's dryer outlet was different, or the RV outlet was different, right? There were a couple little plug and play things that I had to do to figure that out to get that working. But it does work. It's not going to charge at the same speeds as your level two in the garage. It's definitely not going to be like supercharging, right? But it is going to get you what you need for trips like that, or for just an overnight to wake up the next day and be ready to rock and roll.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Aaron, when you bring up those adapters, because Tesla sells them. There's a bunch of different places you can get them, but if you're going to do those long road trips, camping, whatever, and you don't know where you might stop for something like that, having those 5, 6 adapters so you can basically hit any outlet that you've run across can come in handy just for an emergency situation too.
Correct.
Yeah. Tom, did you have something?
Yeah. And you probably already hit on this just a little bit, Aaron, but in an effort to try to be as fair and balanced as we can, we're going through this. Obviously, EVs are newish, and there's probably some things that maybe are better than an ICE vehicle. So you do this cross-country road trip, and was there anything that you felt you were held back by in driving an electric vehicle cross-country as opposed to an ICE vehicle?
That's an interesting question. I think obviously you cannot drive quite as far on one charge as you normally could in what I was used to driving, which is a hybrid vehicle of a Sonata or a Prius, right, where I'm going to get 500 miles on that tank of gas. So you couldn't go quite the same distance per charge or fill up comparatively. But I don't know that it held me back. I think on the long journey, what I was able to gain by those more frequently charges was a much better offset when it came to safety and being alert on the road, because I was so awake and revitalized, making some additional stops and forcing yourself to move around.
Sure.
And I don't think in the end it was really a detriment to the EV versus the ICE vehicle when making such a long journey. Now, if you only had to go 400 miles, then I mean, you're going to have an extra stop in that EV that you might not have to have had in that ICE vehicle, and you could look at it as a detriment for that.
Sure. Yeah, and and this isn't necessarily for you, but just talking about that article from the Wall Street Journal, I'm sitting here as we're talking about it, thinking like that reporter's experience is probably completely true. Like, I have no doubt about it. I don't think that there's any intention for her to mislead or try to be deceptive in her reporting, but I think it's endemic of the education around EVs, as we've all talked about. So our intention with this podcast, this episode, was not to eviscerate the article, to discredit anything she had to say, other than that maybe there was a better experience out there that she could have had with a better education or some research ahead of time, just so we can hit that home.
I agree with that. I would say there are some things that, whether it was that article or the associated, I think it was Wall Street Journal, did a video compilation of some of the reporters across the world who had done some EV experiences. There's something that I routinely see mentioned, and it's something that mentally I had to kind of get past in EV ownership, and that is the impact that accessory usage may have on range. So there's a lot of talk about, well, I'm not using my climate control because I'm trying to get a little extra range type thing. And I found myself early on, and mind you, I've only had the vehicle for a handful of months, but have put a lot of miles on it. I found myself early on thinking about that probably more than I needed to. And I find myself now thinking about it less and just factoring that into the overall usage of the vehicle, which oddly enough is exactly what we do with ICE vehicles, because when you turn your air conditioner on in an ICE vehicle, you get less miles per gallon out of it too, right? It's just you're not seeing it displayed in a number in front of your face. You're just seeing the gauge go down slowly that on your fuel level.
Sure.
So there's some of that that's out there that I think maybe even as EV owners or new EV owners, we may focus on a little bit more than in the end we end up needing to, or that we adapt to over time.
Yep. I think that's a perfect summation of that.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
In the prior podcast, I don't know if you've heard it all, Aaron, if you've listened, but I'm aware that the Kia EV6 has like different drive modes.
I knew you were going there.
The one of them is the old man drive mode. And as you're talking about the accessories, I was just curious if you spend time in old man drive mode to save miles, or if you just put in sport
Bryant,
mode.
that's
and
probably
drive.
just Bryant, if that's what you're asking.
Old man drive mode. You mean eco?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I always
name it
forget. I don't
Bryant
have
mode.
one.
That's okay. Yeah, to be honest, I spend the majority of my drive time in eco. I don't see any reason
Amen.
not to in my daily driving.
Amen.
I did the same with any of my hybrid vehicles, or my children have. I bought a Hyundai Accent for my children a few years back, and I don't drive around in it in sport mode. There's just not really a need for it. Number one, sport mode in a Hyundai Accent is kind of a joke to begin with, but what's the real purpose behind it? Getting on and off an on ramp, right? So I use my sport mode in my EV6 when I do have to either maneuver in and out of traffic, expect to need quick acceleration, or I mean, it's a dog and pony show for friends and family who have never been in an electric vehicle to hit that sport mode and take off and hit that 0 to 60 time, and kind of open their eyes to what an EV can actually do versus their thoughts of everybody, fair or not. My encounters is that everybody still thinks that a Prius is an EV, and the negative stuff associated with a Prius being this slow vehicle that's always in the fast lane at 40 miles an hour type thing. That stereotype is still kind of out there in the ether. So getting them into the EV6, hitting that sport mode and taking off, it's kind of an eye-opening experience. And I'm sure you've experienced that in your Teslas as well.
Yeah, I mean yeah, I mean it's definitely fun. And earlier on we talked some of the original podcast episodes about the acceleration being really what made me get interested in EVs long ago. But one thing that I noticed in the BMW i4 M50, which is analogous to the Tesla Model 3 Performance, very very fast vehicles, even in the eco mode, is it still was plenty fast. I mean, faster than almost everything out there, especially just even on the highway. So I took that car from Pennsylvania down to North Carolina when I purchased it a few months ago, and again, even in the eco mode, it's got plenty of power. What has Brian and Aaron's experience been with the EV6 and eco mode? I'll take Tom off the list here because I know he's going to be kind of all sport mode all the time. But what was your experience with the acceleration in eco mode? Is that enough for day-to-day driving?
I think so. I'm with Aaron. One, I'm glad he validated me because I've been attacked for driving eco mode on road trips. So I'm glad there's a validation of someone who drove 4,500 miles and drove the same way I did. So I feel validated here. But yeah, I eco mode I'm 99% of the time, and I only put it in sport to pass people on the freeway or on a 2-lane highway. Or to Aaron's point, it's like, hey, you got a Prius, that sucks. And it's like, hey, let's go for a ride. It's like, not a Prius. So I 100% agree with what you're saying. But I don't know why. I feel like eco mode's enough for daily for me. But Aaron, what do you think?
No, I'm 100% with you on that. My daily drive is spent in eco mode. Now, mind you, I do take some journeys around rural Ohio, and it's nice to have that little advanced tightness in the steering when I put it in sport mode to go around some of the nice rural roads in Ohio. But for the most part, I don't see any point in not having it in eco mode when I drive. Um, I don't even think twice about it, to be honest.
Aaron, I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and chat with us about your experiences in the travel, and I look forward to seeing more from you in the future. And thank you.
Well, pleasure's all mine, guys.
Yeah,
Thanks,
it was
Aaron.
awesome chat, Aaron. You're super knowledgeable. I love your passion, love your enthusiasm. Really cool story you had on your road trip.
Thank you for listening to Plug In for More. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. In the meantime, check out the one-stop EV marketplace, evuniverse.com. Until next time.